And I also didn't like the way he was spouting the big lie. I thought that was irresponsible, but he took it much further than even I expected or anyone expected. And during this time, he was being told by lawyers in the White House that if he kept on doing this, he would spend the rest of his life tangling with the criminal justice process. And that's exactly what's happened. He shouldn't be surprised, and no one else should be surprised.
Well, the fact that he...
United States of America versus Donald J. Trump.
Instead of a campaign fight, a courtroom one for Donald Trump, as 3 judges heard arguments in his claim that he's immune from prosecution for his alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election.
A president has to have immunity. And the other thing is, I did nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong.
Trump accused of spreading lies and trying to hold on to power despite his loss. He insists he was simply exposing voter fraud.
If I wasn't given immunity, then other presidents, when we talked about today, President Obama with the drone strikes, which were very bad, they were mistakes, terrible mistakes. You really can't put a president in that position.
But the judges sounded skeptical a president should have absolute immunity after leaving office.
Based on the questions today and the briefs that have been written, I expect that they will decide that former President Trump is not above the law and that he can be prosecuted.
Former U.S. Attorney John Fishwick on Trump's claim a president can't be prosecuted unless they've first been impeached and convicted by Congress.
This is an important legal issue. There's not a lot of law in this area, so I think the Supreme Court is going to be the ultimate decision maker on this issue.
I did not vote for Trump. I don't intend to vote for Trump, but I want to have a right to vote against Trump. I don't want it to be taken away by some Secretary of State or some judge. If you're going to prosecute the man running against the incumbent president, it better be a really slam dunk case, and I don't think any of these cases meet that criteria.
Timing is a big factor, too. This case is scheduled to go to trial March 4th. That's just one day before Super Tuesday, when millions of voters in more than a dozen states will cast their ballots. In Washington, I'm Scott Thuman.
January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like. Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. Because he was angry he'd lost an election. Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot for a disgraceful dereliction of duty. The House accused the former president of, quote, incitement. That is a specific term from the criminal law. Let me just put that aside for a moment and reiterate something I said weeks ago. There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth. The issue is not only the president's intemperate language on January 6th. It is not just his endorsement of remarks in which an associate urged, quote, trial by combat, It was also the entire manufactured atmosphere of looming catastrophe, the increasingly wild myths about a reverse landslide election that was somehow being stolen, some secret coup by our now president. Now, I defended the president's right to bring any complaints to our legal system. The legal system spoke. The Electoral College spoke. As I stood up and said clearly at that time, the election was settled. It was over. But that just really opened a new chapter of even wilder, and more unfounded claims. The leader of the free world cannot spend weeks thundering that shadowy forces are stealing our country and then feign surprise when people believe him and do reckless things. Now, sadly, many politicians sometimes make overheated comments or use metaphors. We saw that unhinged listeners might take literally, but that was different. That's different from what we saw. This was an intensifying crescendo of conspiracy theories orchestrated by an outgoing president who seemed determined to either overturn the voters' decision or else torch our institutions on the way out. The unconscionable behavior did not end when the violence actually began. Whatever our ex-president claims he thought might happen that day, whatever reaction he says he meant to produce by that afternoon, we know he was watching the same live television as the rest of us. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. He was the only one who could. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. The president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. No. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily, as the chaos unfolded. He kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Now, even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in serious danger, even as the mob, carrying Trump banners, was beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his own vice president. Now, predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the mob seem to interpret this as a further inspiration to lawlessness and violence, not surprisingly. Later, even when the president did half-heartedly begin calling for peace, he didn't call right away for the riot to end. He did not tell the mob to depart until even later. And even then, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors, he kept repeating election lies and praising the criminals.
That if you had concluded that the president committed the crime of obstruction, you could not publicly state that in your report or here today.
Well, I would say the statement would be that you would not indict, and you would not indict because under the OLC opinion, a sitting president, excuse me, cannot be indicted, be unconstitutional.
So you could not state that because of the OLC opinion, if that would have been your conclusion.
OLC opinion with some guide, yes.
But under DOJ, under Department of Justice policy, the president could be prosecuted for obstruction of justice crimes after he leaves office, is correct?
True.
Thank you.
With me tonight, my good friends Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell, hosts of The Rachel Maddow Show and The Last Word right here on MSNBC. Rachel, I will say something. I am mad at myself for how surprised I was. I was mad at myself as the time went by, the 2.5 weeks, and I think a lot of people thought, and this was with informed speculation by people I respect, people who've clerked on the court, people who've been around the court, studied the court, know the court, there is no way they could take 2.5 weeks only then to say we're taking the case 7 weeks from now. What was your reaction to the order today?
I mean, I don't think you should be mad at yourself. I don't think you should be embarrassed. I think everybody sort of thought that was the only kind of decent explanation for how long they were taking, that they were going to not take up the case, that maybe Samuel Alito or one of the other real MAGA judges was going to be really mad about it, was going to write an angry dissent, was biding for as much time as he could because this was his last chance to insert delay, which of course is what Trump wants. I think that was, you know, if you think about the court as the Supreme Court of the United States and a rational actor and a decent one, that was a reasonable supposition, and it just turns out they're not that. And Chris, I feel you in terms of the emotion that you're bringing to this right now, and the sort of sense of urgency with which you're underscoring what this means. It's true. There just isn't any way around it. And I feel like for people who haven't been following this, if you want to know why there's a hair on fire reaction to this, if you haven't been following every interstitial, incremental bit of progress here, the important question here is not whether the Supreme Court is going to decide that Donald Trump and all presidents are immune from prosecution for crimes they committed while they were president. I mean, it would be fully insane for them to actually side with Trump here, right? Remember, this is the case where Trump's lawyer was asked by Judge Florence Pan in the appeals court, are you telling me that this guy that a president could order the assassination of his political rivals and there could be no prosecution for that? That would be okay? We'd have to let that go? Not only for the duration of his presidency, but for the duration of his life? That would be okay? And Trump's lawyers are basically like, yeah. So the idea that they're going to side with him on immunity is unthinkable and also beside the point. The conclusion that we can arrive at now based on what they have done without having to wait for the ruling is that they are ensuring that Trump will not face trial. And when they inevitably rule that presidents aren't immune from prosecution after they leave office, what that will tell Donald Trump, if by then he is president, is that he can never leave the office of the presidency. Right. And if he is voted out in 2028, he cannot leave office, and he is willing to he is welcome to commit any crimes he wants to, as long as he is still president, in order to ignore the result of that election and stay in power for life, because otherwise he's going to go to prison when he gets out. That is the way this is going to go unless the country votes Trump out, votes for Biden and against Trump in November.
Yeah, that point about the incentive structure produced by this is one that I hadn't even thought about, but it's very clearly correct. There's also, Lawrence, the point that Rachel made there, which I think is sort of interesting. I was talking to people today or watching people's reaction to the news, and just the sort of the court's hope that the kind of anodyne procedural nature means that what they're doing is illegible. right? That they can do this and like, oh, and then the news alert is like, the court will take up the immunity argument. It's like, oh, that sounds reasonable. When are they going to do it? Oh, in April. Okay, well, that's part of the play here, that they're insulated from the backlash.
Well, you know, I hate to break the mood. If that's,
Please break the mood, buddy.
So my hair isn't even warm.
Good.
On fire. But here's why. Okay, here's why. And let me just work backwards, because I think the most important thing you said in your opening remarks is that this outcome should not be up to 5 members of the United States Supreme Court. It is really up to you, the voter, and that's a version of what Rachel was just saying too. These votes, these 4 votes, because this piece of paper, all you need is 4 votes in the Supreme Court to turn out this piece of paper today. These 4 votes can be proven less important by the American people in the way they cast their own votes in November. I personally believe, having seen how well Joe Biden did in Michigan, having seen how badly Donald Trump did in Michigan and in the other states, that Joe Biden is going to be reelected. And that's why I am not worried at all about the timetable. Because we have to remind the viewers, the reason everyone's worried about the timetable is they're worried that Donald Trump becomes president on January 20th, and on the 21st, he kills both federal cases.
Yes.
But let's also remember, and I know this was just been talking about the federal case so far, Donald Trump is going to trial in New York City on March 25th on an election interference case for his first presidential election.
That is also true.
And the star witness is going to be a porn star, Stormy Daniels, whose testimony is going to be very well understood by every Trump voter out there. In fact, way more clearly understood than maybe most of the testimony in Jack Smith's case. So those things are going to happen. Let's talk about how each side won something in this decision by the court. And by the way, these things are always one page, so I'm not going to be horrified by that. They are saying that the only question they're going to entertain is whether and to what extent does a former president enjoy presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during his tenure in office. That's the only question you're allowed to talk about in the Supreme Court. You know what that means? They just threw out half of Donald Trump's appeal, which was the double jeopardy part.
Yes, correct.
They threw it out, and they threw it out right on that single piece of paper. So they're losing already. Jack Smith won here, too, because Jack Smith said, I want to go straight to the Supreme Court. They weren't asking to go to the Supreme Court. Trump's lawyers were asking to send this case back to the 11th Circuit. That's what they were actually asking for. Supreme Court said, no.
We're going to take it.
You're coming right here.
Okay, but
so they could have delayed it more than an extra month by sending it back to the circuit.
So I don't disagree with you on the sort of channel of, is this do or die for the country? Because if he doesn't go to trial, he's going to win. I agree with you. Right? I agree that
the first day of the appeal.
Yeah.
If you find him guilty on this, he's going to go out on the courthouse steps and say, I'm appealing. By the way, he'll be standing on the courthouse steps probably sometime in April.
Doing the same thing.
Doing the same thing, maybe even before the Supreme Court rules. He'll be saying, I'm going to appeal the Stormy Daniels case.
So for me, I think my reaction to it isn't necessarily about the implications for what it means for the electoral chances of Donald Trump. It is a level of cravenness from the court that they're moving at this pace that I find deeply unnerving. You know what I mean? Like because the court, the thing about the court is they move fast when they want to move fast, they move slow when they want to move slow.
This particular court has never moved that fast. You know, when we look back at the Nixon court, the court that found against Nixon, we look at the Bush v. Gore court. But this court, you know, it's fast for them.
Right.
You know, but I do agree, this is the most isolated court in the history of the court. So they think this is going to appear to be fast.
You just referenced the Nixon court, Rachel, and you have spent a lot of time on that period. Kate, my wife, who's forgotten more about law than I'll ever know, and who I basically just cheat off for everything, pointed out to me today that in '74, I think it's U.S. v. Nixon, the court heard arguments in July and they issued an opinion 3 weeks later. And her point about that was just that, look, that's the most similar case that we've had in our history is U.S. v. Nixon. And they, in terms of the actual opinion, moved quite quickly on that, and it was a unanimous opinion.
Well, yeah, and the other, I mean, The other big, like Nixon, if we're going to carry forward a thing from Nixon here, when you talk about the cravenness of the court, Chris, the cravenness of the court is evident in what they are doing with the pacing here, right? Like putting this off for 7 weeks, sitting on it for 2 weeks for no reason, obviously pushing all of the cases that they can push, pushing them to the point where Trump will be standing for election before any of us have heard the verdicts in any of those cases. Got it. It's the timing. But it's also the idea that the immunity thing is an open question, right? Is really presidential immunity an open question? Because what's the most famous pardon in American history? Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon once he had resigned and was a former president. Why did Gerald Ford pardon Richard Nixon? Quote, as a result of certain acts or omissions occurring before his resignation as president, meaning as a result of stuff he did while president, quote, Richard Nixon has become liable to possible indictment and trial. Whether or not he shall be so prosecuted depends on findings of the appropriate grand jury and the discretion of the authorized prosecutor. So the idea that this is an open question, that it might be that a former president can never be tried for something that he did because he was president when he did it, is disproven by a plain reading of American history and the whole justification for Richard Nixon being pardoned in the first place. So the idea that this has to be taken up is them saying the sky is green.
Right.
And I think even for the non-lawyers among us to be able to say, you know what, the sky is not green even on our worst day, this is BS. You are doing this as a dilatory tactic to help your political friend, your partisan patron. And for you to say that this is something that the court needs to decide because it's something that's unclear in the law is just flagrant bullpucky. And they know it, and they don't care that we know it, and that's disturbing about the future legitimacy of the court.
Professor Tribe, so glad to have you here tonight on this important night. What is your reaction to the Supreme Court deciding to hear this case?
Well, I was quite convinced, given how long they were taking, that they were likely to decide to hear it. What I didn't know, and what is very disappointing, is that they would formulate the question presented at a level of enormous abstraction so that the delay that we've already seen may just be the beginning. That is, the question presented is now whether and to what extent does a president have immunity after he leaves office from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during his tenure. Well, of course, Donald Trump alleges that everything was an official act. Jack Smith is at the opposite end. Instead of that, if they really had any interest in expedition, any interest in satisfying the public need to get this trial going and to have a verdict one way or the other before the election, they would have asked a narrower question. They would have simply asked whether a president charged with criminally seeking to remain in office beyond the end of his term has absolute immunity from prosecution for crimes committed in that vein. That would have been the right question to ask, and it could only have had one answer. This question is so sweeping that there are a lot of ways of answering it. Yes, the president might have some degree of immunity for some official acts, but that is not the real issue. John Roberts long ago said that if a case doesn't require you to address a particular question, then as a federal judicial official, you shouldn't answer that question. You shouldn't reach out. By reaching out in this way, the court has guaranteed not only that there would be this bizarre delay, they could have taken this issue before them back in last December, not only that there be that delay, but now the delay until late April before hearing the case. There's no reason to have that several-month delay. In the Bush v. Gore case, everything moved 10 times as fast. This is a much simpler matter. it could have been resolved quite quickly. And the really weird thing is that essentially everyone knows where the story has to end. It cannot be the case that when a president is in office and tries to remain in office after losing an election and commits the crimes that are involved in that he is forever immune from prosecution. Yet that is what would have to happen to give this president immunity. So since we know that that's where the story has to end, to drag it out this way and have a virtual guarantee that the court won't decide anything until late June, it might decide this broad legal question and send the case back to the DC Circuit. Even if it doesn't, no trial is likely to begin before October. In any event, no verdict of either kind, acquit or convict, is likely to happen before the election. And as a result, the people of the United States are confronted with basically a Supreme Court that is suppressing evidence that they need in order to decide intelligently whether the person they are voting for is guilty of the extreme felony of trying to steal an election and remain in office. That's an unconscionable way to proceed, and yet that's what the Supreme Court has arranged by the way it's organized this case.
So you're focusing on the exact words of the question, and the Supreme Court gives the lawyers the question they want them to address. Right. You're focusing on the part where it says alleged to involve prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during his tenure in office. That seems, the way you're reading it, to open the Supreme Court to arguments about each particular bit of evidence in the case. Was it an official act when President Donald Trump was asking Vice President Mike Pence to change the electoral vote count? Was it an official act when he was calling the Secretary of State of Georgia? Is that where the Supreme Court could end up here, evaluating each action described in the indictment?
Or laying out a blueprint and sending the case back to the Court of Appeals to evaluate the allegations, so that this is a formula for indefinite delay. I'm focusing also on the fact that the court asks whether, and if so, to what extent is there immunity? The question of whether the immunity is absolute or reaches only to a certain extent is a complicated question, the only complicated question in this case. It's the only one that the DC Circuit punted on, and it may be the one that the U.S. Supreme Court focuses on, namely, what is the contour of the president's official duties? What kinds of official duties are immune from criminal prosecution? It's an sort of open season for legal scholars, legal philosophers, not the kind of thing that a court that is supposed to be deciding the case before it ought to decide. This is a way of making it a much more complicated case, where the bottom line at the very end of all this backing and forthing is fairly clear, quite evident. The president can't have the absolute immunity to steal an election by obstructing the proceedings of Congress up to and including fomenting violence. That can't be immune from prosecution. Yet that is exactly what Jack Smith says he has the power to prosecute. So there's plenty of fault to go around here. Merrick Garland waited too long before appointing a special counsel. The special counsel proceeded with all deliberate speed, but even he could have gone a bit faster. This indictment could have been brought somewhat earlier. The case could have been narrowed. Perhaps it will be after the Supreme Court has its say. But if Donald Trump is reelected, the case goes away. So that even if we all agree that presidents can't be kings, they can't be above the law, after they leave, they're just citizens. Even if we all agree with that, in every practical sense, this president will have ended up being above the law, because he will have managed to use the procedural gimmicks and gears of the legal system to avoid being held accountable before he could again assume office and make the whole trial go away. It's not the way a country that is concerned to preserve the rule of law and constitutional democracy would proceed. And I think the court bears some real responsibility for proceeding the way it has.